On December 7th, 1958, a family woke up to a cosy Sunday morning in Oregon with the plan to spend some quality time together, enjoying each other's company and getting ready for the festive season. Kenneth Martin was 54 years old and a cheerful man known for his outgoing personality. He worked at an appliance company where he supervised the repair department, and his trustworthy attitude and stable income meant that his 48-year-old wife, Barbara Martin, could be a homemaker and focus on raising their 3 daughters, Barbie, Virginia, and Susan. Barbie was 14 years old, the eldest daughter and a freshman at Grant High School, but the couple also had a son named Donald, and he was a little bit older than the rest of the Martin children. He was 28 years old and worked as a pharmacist's mate in the US Navy and tied with the Marine Corps. He was stationed in Fort Schuyler, New York, the almost exact opposite end of the country, the day that his family was getting ready for Christmas that year, something that would be an important part of his story later on. But for the rest of the Martins, Kenneth and Barbara had been to a Christmas party the night before, so they took their time getting up to enjoy a family breakfast with their daughters the next day. Around 10:30, the family had some visitors when Mr. and Mrs. Evans, who were cousins of Barbara Martin, came over, and they brought their 7-year-old daughter and her friend with them. The idea was that the children could play while the adults spent some time catching up, and the two families enjoyed each other's company for a little while, but the Evanses couldn't stay for long. They were on their way to a Sunday dinner, and Mrs. Evans actually invited the Martins along, something that could have changed the entire course of this case, but Kenneth and Barbara refused. They said that they wanted to spend the rest of their day going along the highway and foraging with the girls to find some greenery that they could turn into Christmas decorations together later on, and so the families went their separate ways. Between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. that day, the Martins piled into the family car and took off to see what they could find, and this wasn't unusual for the Martins. Friends and other family members would later say how the family enjoyed spending time together, particularly outdoors, and that they would often take trips, just driving around and hiking or walking together out in nature. And on the 7th of December 1958, it looked like it was going to be another one of those days. The Martins were spotted around 4 p.m. at a gas station in Cascade Locks, around 64 kilometres from the family home, and a little while later eating at a Paradise snack bar in Hood River, another 32 kilometres or so from the gas station. No one reported anything unusual about them, or even that anyone had been acting suspiciously towards them, but the Martins were reported as missing when Kenneth failed to show up for work and the girls for their classes the very next day. The police were dispatched to the home around 11 p.m. Monday night, where they found nothing out of the ordinary. Magazines were still strewn across the floor from where the girls had been reading them the day before, the dishes from breakfast were still on the drying rack in the kitchen, and there was a load of laundry finished and waiting in the washing machine, but there was no family car and no one else in the house. Friends and family hadn't heard anything from the Martins since the Evanses had left them the day before, and the neighbours hadn't seen them or their car since Kenneth had driven it out with his family inside it to go and find some Christmas decorations. Fearing the worst, the police quickly began searching the area and the tracks of the highway that the Martins had last been seen at, but what they found would only raise more questions. They didn't find any traces of the family car, but they did find an abandoned and stolen white Chevrolet registered to an address in Los Angeles. But perhaps more chillingly, they found a bloody gun and a woman's glove tossed into the bushes nearby. Trying to keep their focus, the police on the case initially didn't look at the car that closely, as it didn't match the description of the one that they were looking for. The Martins had a cream and red coloured Ford station wagon, and that was what the police were trying to keep most of their attention on. But they had a look at the Chevrolet again when an analysis of the gun came back with some puzzling clues. The serial number on the gun traced it back to a Meyer and Frank grocery store, and the gun was listed among some of the items that Donald Martin had once been accused of stealing just 2 years previously when he'd been working there. Donald had a firm alibi as he was stationed in New York and accounted for that day. But what that gun did was tie the abandoned Chevrolet to the disappearances and give the police a new lead to investigate. Looking at the dried blood that covered the gun, the police had grim expectations, so they kept an eye on the family's bank accounts to see if any withdrawals were made that would indicate that they were still alive, or maybe even pinpoint a location where their potential attackers may be. But there were no activities on any of their accounts, and the police had a theory as to why that could be. The very next day after the Chevrolet was discovered, 2 arrests were made in Hood County in connection to the stolen vehicle. 2 ex-convicts, an unnamed man and a man called Roy Light, were arrested on suspicion of car theft, specifically that white Chevrolet, and this put them firmly on the investigators' radars. The running theory was that the 2 men had gotten rid of the Martins and had simply not had enough time to empty their bank accounts before they'd been picked up by officers. So investigators honed in on the 2 and tried to build up the potential connection between the white Chevrolet and the gun that Donald Martin had been accused of stealing, and the 2 ex-convicts' ties to the Martins became more concrete when a waitress from the Paradise snack bar came forward. This waitress, who actually knew Roy Light, remembered seeing the 2 ex-convicts there at the same time as the Martins, and she remembered that they had left shortly after the Martins had. With this new information, the police put the pressure on Roy Light and the man that he'd been arrested with, but the men gave them nothing new about the missing family. Investigators had their suspicions and they had their suspects, but what they lacked was any real physical evidence tying them to the disappearances or even to the scene, and they had another kink in their theory to work out as well. Sightings of the Martin family were still being called into the tip lines, some of them quite believable, and if those sightings were correct, that meant that the Martins were still alive and well, and investigators just had to find them. With no bodies and no real evidence tying the 2 men to foul play, Roy Light and the other unnamed ex-convict were not charged with anything concerning the Martin family. In the months that followed the disappearances, one of the biggest searches ever conducted in Oregon led to hundreds of new leads, over 200 of which came in as just letters sent to the police in the hopes that the information witnesses had could lead to the recovery of the family. Investigators followed up on all of them, but the leads eventually went cold and the investigation came to a screeching stop. And by February 1959, the most substantial lead that the investigators had didn't leave anyone feeling any warmer. A volunteer found car tracks leading off a cliff in the Dalles, an inspection of the tracks showing that they could have belonged to a Ford station wagon. Investigators then found paint chips in the area that they'd sent off to the FBI for analysis, and the results came back to say that it was the same kind of paint used on the particular model of station wagon that the Martins had. Investigators wanted to follow up on this, and the Bonneville Dam was lowered by 5 feet to allow divers and sonar equipment to be used in the searches of the water. However, after an extensive search, investigators and other volunteers were unable to find anything, and the Martin family remained missing. On the 1st of May, a river drilling rig near the Dalles reported their anchor catching on something quite heavy in the water, but whatever it was, the anchor broke free before it could be pulled out of the water. The very next day, a couple reported seeing what looked like 2 bodies floating in the water around Cascade Rocks, and after they'd called it in, investigators went down to have a look themselves. They found the badly decomposed body of a young girl on the riverbank the day after the couple reported seeing it, but it would take some time for investigators to be able to piece together who she was. Little remained of the girl to be able to make a positive identification from her face or her body, but combining an identification of the clothing and a dental examination, she was positively identified as 11-year-old Susan Martin. The family dentist was able to match the fillings in her teeth as the ones he'd put in and still had in his records. He claimed that it would be highly unlikely that someone else would have the exact same fillings in exactly the same teeth and place, so the identification was set in stone, and the first Martin family member was found. This did little to encourage investigators, family and friends that the rest of the Martins were alive, and hopes only dwindled further when another body of a young girl was discovered the very next day. Her remains were identified as the 13-year-old Virginia Martin, and an autopsy stated the official cause of death as drowning. Traces of aluminium were found on the girl's clothing, which would be keeping with the tyre tracks found on the cliff earlier in the search. The tracks and where the rig would later report their anchor snagging on something were opposite an aluminium smelting plant, and investigators believe that the rig had caught onto the door of the Martins' car, or maybe even the car itself, and turned over, taking the door with it and allowing two of the bodies to float out of the car and downstream. Another search of the water in the area came back empty-handed, and they were eventually called off altogether when a driver nearly drowned, leaving the fates of Kenneth, Barbara and Barbie to remain a mystery to this day. Based on the tracks, the gun and the potential ties to the ex-convicts, investigators have maintained their theory that the Martins met with foul play that day, but they've been unable to tie enough evidence from the scenes or the autopsy reports to prove their case, or even to formally charge anyone with their disappearances and deaths. This left the only remaining member of the Martin family, their son Donald, without answers as well. He had to wait the mandatory 7 years to be able to claim anything from the family's estate, but 8 years after their disappearances, he was able to inherit the family's home and what was left in their bank accounts. When the investigation stalled again, the bodies of Susan and Virginia were cremated and left unclaimed in a crematorium for over a decade. They were actually left there until the death of their paternal grandmother, leading them to be collected by an unnamed person while they were making plans for the funeral, leaving the closing chapter of this story on perhaps the saddest note it could be left on.